Hello, my name is David, and in this video I'll be covering how I created Monsters Down Under, the 8th film in my Dinosauria Animated Series. I'll be going over everything, the science behind the film, my concept art, how I 3D model, rig and animate these prehistoric animals, and even go over how I created this big clay Kronosaurus sculpture I made for the film as well. The animated short films may be the final result, but there is so much more research and artwork that goes into each and every one of these projects. So, let's get started. When I started work on Dinosauria Volume 2, I set out to make 5 new films, so I needed 5 new ideas. Terrible Lizards and Hunted by Moonlight, as well as the upcoming Fighting Dinosaurs and 2 Titans, all solidified themselves pretty quickly on this list. But the obligatory Ocean episode I wanted to make, episode 3, took me the longest to really nail down. The Ocean episode of Dinosauria Volume 1 was Sea and Sky, and it's probably the weakest of the series. I don't think it's a bad film, it's just the shortest and the least impressive. It was also very technically challenging, and I struggled a lot when it came to rigging and puppeteering the pterosaurs, as well as animating the sea. One of my main goals for Volume 2's Ocean episode was to tackle the sea again, and do it better. The first serious idea I had for Volume 2 Episode 3 was going to be called Hell's Aquarium. Like Sea and Sky, this film would have taken place in the Western Interior Seaway, but this time follow a young Hesperornis on his first dive. I even got as far as creating character models for this film and doing some test animation. However, I very quickly realised that I'd much rather explore new places in Dinosauria Volume 2 than return to old ones. The second serious contender for the obligatory Ocean episode was an idea I had called Fire and Water, which was going to tell the story of the famous Borealopelta fossil. This frankly beautiful ankylosaur specimen was found in a marine deposit, and the film was going to tell a potential story of how this animal lived, how it died, and how it ended up buried at the bottom of the sea. Fire and Water was also scrapped, partly because of how technically ambitious some of the sequences were going to be, but mainly because I couldn't confidently depict any pterosaurs in this setting, and I really wanted to animate another big pterosaur. I don't remember exactly what first drew me to Australia for the final film. I think I was just reading about Mesozoic formations that include both terrestrial and marine life, eventually stumbling upon the Tullabuck Formation in Queensland, and it was a far more alien and bizarre place than I expected. You see, modern Australia is hot and dry, but during the early Cretaceous the continent was still attached to Antarctica, so it was instead very wet and cold for Mesozoic standards. It was a weird place, with a giant inland sea covering a lot of the landmass, full of animals that, to me, feel just a little too ancient for the time period, with pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs feeling a whole lot more like the last echoes of the Jurassic over what I associate with the Cretaceous. I got so interested in this world that I had decided that my main goal at this point for this film was to just take the viewer to this place that was totally taking over my imagination. I wanted the film to be an eerie journey through this totally otherworldly environment. Almost as if the film was exploring a different planet. A beautiful place, full of amazing things, but unknowable, ancient, and alien things. There's an amount of uncertainty, of individual interpretation to all of my Dinosauria films, an amount of ambiguity to the story and motivation of the characters, because these characters don't speak, there's no narration, they're not people, they're animals. I think this ambiguity is a huge strength of the series, and for Monsters Down Under I really wanted to double down on this type of mysterious, ambiguous storytelling. I wanted all of the creatures above ground, the dinosaurs, to be pretty easy to read, so I based their behaviours more so on mammals. Things like dogs and cows, animals that human beings find pretty easy to relate to and understand. This was to contrast everything in the sea, that I instead wanted to feel like totally unknowable, ancient eldritch beings. I wanted this film to feel alien. It's full of strange interactions between strange creatures. Even the main plot, the most structured part of this film, this very long and very violent interaction between these two Kronosaurus, is never totally explained to the viewer. I didn't want people to totally understand what these animals were doing, but what they're doing isn't random either. It's not without reason. Their actions are very natural and very purposeful. I personally love watching animals do weird animal stuff that doesn't make sense, and attempting to understand their worlds, their totally alien perspectives. And that feeling of not quite knowing what you're seeing, but being infatuated, is the exact feeling of like natural world mystery and fascination that I wanted to capture with this film. Which I'm about to totally shatter as I explain exactly what happened during that Kronosaurus scene. The reality of what happens between these two animals is that a younger male enters the territory of a larger and older female. He kills a plesiosaur to both get her attention and to present it to her as a gift, and attempts to court her with deep, bellowing calls. He's young, he's unscarred, so she isn't convinced. The pair then surface, take a deep breath, and wait. This is a speculative, ritualized courtship dance, or courtship challenge more like. It's a breath-holding competition. She wants to see how long he can remain submerged while she stares him down. An hour passes, and the inexperienced, unscarred male keeps bellowing, running out of air too quickly, and is forced to resurface. The scarred female, being a big, angry, predatory sea monster, sees this as a moment of weakness and can't help but violently attack him. However, he doesn't give up. Attempting to prove his strength once again, bleeding and bruised, the pair take another breath. The female, at this point, with blood in the water, becomes very restless, and unfortunately, the male barely lasts a few minutes this time due to his injuries. He makes another break for the surface, she attacks him once again, and he passes out. The female now thinks it's over, she's dealt with the intruder. But after sinking to the bottom of the sea, the male miraculously gets a second wind, springs to life, and races for the surface. Breaching, inhaling, and crashing back down into the sea, he bellows once again. No longer unscarred, he has finally proved his strength, and the female joins him in song. The film then jumps ahead to springtime, perhaps a year, 2 years later, and the female gives birth to a new calf. A calf that shares the young male's colours. I have made large clay sculptures for each and every single one of my Dinosauria films. And for Monsters Down Under, I of course decided to sculpt a Kronosaurus. I started the sculpture with a piece of aluminium wire, which I wrapped in paper, and then wrapped in foil, and then wrapped in clay. In addition to this big ugly slug, I also flattened out 4 flippery shapes, and rolled out what would eventually become the tail and the head. I then waited for all of these pieces to dry, and embedded them all, except the head, into the main body of the piece. I use air drying clay for the majority of my sculptures, but I've also gotten into the habit of using Milliput to strengthen certain areas of my models. Milliput is just a whole lot more durable, so I use it for small parts or sticky outy parts, things like the flippers, which would otherwise be prone to snagging on things and breaking. I sculpted the head completely separately, because it's the focal point and therefore requires the most attention. The teeth were a challenge. I must have resculpted the teeth on this model like 5 or 6 times before I was finally satisfied. Eventually, I decided to just sculpt the teeth separately in Milliput and push them into the wet DAZ clay to create this final snaggle-toothed look. I attached this sculpture to its base very early on, and this gave me a super convenient handle to hold onto while I worked on it. However, the more I bulked this piece out, the more clay I layered on to form the final shape, the more front heavy it got, and the moment I finally attached the head, the whole piece fell forward. So, I was forced to saw the original base off, drill a new hole into the sculpture at an angle that would better support its weight, and completely remounted it. At this point, I was happy with the general shape of the Kronosaurus and started the final layer of detail work. To do this, I flattened out thin layers of DAZ air drying clay, wrapped that clay around the model, and began carving the final skin details into this wet canvas. These animals would have had scales, but these scales would have been very fine and impossible to see at the scale my model is at. A smooth-skinned Kronosaurus is not a fun Kronosaurus to sculpt though, so I decided to exaggerate the skin details a little with scales and wrinkles and folds where you'd expect to see them. Once I was happy with the sculpt, I primed the piece, I painted the piece, and I sang to the piece. This sculpture came together incredibly quickly. It was one of the easiest pieces of the series so far. This was for many reasons. This is a comparatively simple body form with no claws or hands or feet. None of this animal really has to look like it's bearing any weight, like how a terrestrial animal would, so that wasn't a concern. But most importantly, this whole piece is floating, and the pose is super open. This meant I could sculpt away at any part of the sculpture at any time, made even easier since the sculpture has its own handle that I could grab and turn and manipulate without fear of ruining my work. I love this sculpture. I think it's one of my best in a while. It just looks alive. It looks marine. It looks like a lizard, it looks like a crocodile, it looks like a whale, it looks like a real animal. In fact, this piece is heavily based on another sculpture I made many years ago of a humpback whale and her calf, which are in very similar poses and I think look very cool next to each other. Here's my new Kronosaurus sculpture next to my Megalosaurus and my Scutellosaurus. And here it is next to the rest of the Dinosauria sculpture family. Kronosaurus queenslandicus was a pliosaur and is the star species of this film. It lived in Australia 100 to 120 million years ago, with size estimates between 9 and 11 metres in length, making it easily one of the biggest pliosaurs to ever exist. My Kronosaurus design is heavily countershaded, with very dark tones on top and very light tones underneath. This is a very common design trend in pliosaur paleoart, and for very good reason. Not just because of Walking with Dinosaurs, these are just the most realistic colours for this animal. Most marine animals today, especially big predatory ones like sharks and dolphins, orcas, many whales, have stark, dark light countershading just like this. However, there's both a male and a female in this film, and I needed them to have distinct designs so the viewer could easily tell them apart. The male is younger and more colourful, with blue-teal accents, and the female is older, duller, more scarred, and has white, orca-like eye spots. I initially toyed with the idea of making one of these animals albino to make them easier to differentiate, but ultimately decided to save that idea for a later film in the series. In Monsters Down Under, I depict Kronosaurus as a solitary and hyper-aggressive animal. And we do have evidence of intraspecific aggression in this species, potentially even cannibalism, with a subadult Kronosaurus skull preserving what look to be bite marks from a larger individual. I think we actually have multiple specimens showing this, but it's fitting for a creature named after the Greek titan Kronos, who devoured their children. The Kronosaurus is also depicted giving live birth in the film. I don't actually know if we have any direct evidence of this in pliosaurs specifically, but live birth is an incredibly common adaptation for marine tetrapods. Amnio eggs just don't survive underwater, and Kronosaurus was definitely not hauling itself onto land like a sea turtle to lay its eggs. The mother Kronosaurus is also shown exhibiting at least some parental care in the film. I don't know exactly how reasonable this is, but it is believed that plesiosaurs gave birth to very few, very large babies, like, say, whales, rather than tons and tons of little babies, like, again, say, sea turtles. And most animals today that pour a ton of resources into one big baby tend to take care of that baby for at least a little while. The Kronosaurus sound effects in Monsters Down Under do have alligator hisses and elephant grumbles in them, but like virtually every single animal in this whole series, the majority of this creature's voice is my voice, just slowed down, pitch shifted, and combined with other sounds. Here's a short breakdown of how I created some of these sound effects. And it's not just the grunts, the snorts, and the coughs. I think 95% of the Kronosaurus vocals in this film are based on my voice, including the courtship bellowing. Sticking with marine reptiles, the second animal I'll be covering in this video is the plesiosaur Eromangosaurus. Although an elasmosauroid who tend to have very long, very skinny necks, I decided to shorten the neck in my reconstruction and fatten the animal up a little. I did this because these seem like reasonable adaptations for an animal living in a cooler sea than most other elasmosaurs. We have found evidence of blubber on other plesiosaurs, so I feel this body form is more than reasonable. Plesiosaurs couldn't chew, so like many dinosaurs, they swallowed stones called gastroliths to help grind up food in their stomachs. It's been suggested that this extra weight could have also helped these animals submerge themselves, and this little idea inspired one of my favourite moments in this film, in which the male Kronosaurus rips into the gut of the Eromangosaurus specifically to spill the gastroliths. And without this extra weight, the carcass floats to the surface, so he can begin his display. Completing the marine reptile trio, the third animal I'll be discussing in this video is the ichthyosaur Platypterygius. Platypterygius australis specifically, the species from Australia. Ichthyosaurs are some of my favourite extinct animals. I just love how weird and stupid they are. Never has a tetrapod re-achieved fish as well as the ichthyosaurs did. I don't think it's particularly obvious in the film, but I did create 3 different variants of the species. Perhaps this range of colours is sexual dimorphism, perhaps ontogenetic change, with the older individuals being the more colourful ones. I never really decided. Platypterygius was unfortunately quite a late addition to the film, which is why it doesn't really get to do much. It wasn't in the original script, I just really wanted an excuse to 3D model, rig and animate an ichthyosaur, and this was the only place I could put one. The next animal I want to talk about is the pterosaur Halaschia, the one that I really wanted to get right. One of my main goals for Monsters Down Under was to tackle the same technical challenges I struggled with back when I created Sea and Sky, and by far the biggest challenge working on that film was rigging and animating the pterosaurs. I wanted to try again, improve my skills, and do better. All in all, I definitely improved. This Halaschia in the film has been totally reworked. It's hard to display on screen, really, but this is an all-new skeleton, it's an all-new mesh, it's an all-new rig, and it flies, walks, and folds up far better than my Geosternbergia did. Fly with me, my brother! Up, up, and away! I do still wish that I could fold the wings further than this though. Something closer to this would be ideal. But at the moment, folding the wings this much on this rig leads to far too many clipping and animation errors. Something I will improve upon for my next pterosaur. Halaschia is an anhanguerid pterosaur which was only recently described, in 2024. It's the most complete pterosaur ever found in Australia, which was the main reason I chose this species. It's only 22% complete, but that 22% crucially contains some skull material which is diagnostic. Premax teeth 4 and 5 are smaller than 3 and 6 in this fossil, which is, as far as I know, unique to this genus. It's kinda hard to tell though in the film because the main Halaschia has 2 teeth missing. While working on this film, I was actually contacted by Rory Duncan, a co-author on that paper, which then led to the lead author, Adele Pentland, getting into contact with me as well. So super special shout out and thank you to Rory, to Adele, to Zev, to Christina, and all the other people at Chronosaurus Corner. Like, you guys are great. And I hope I did your big, ugly, flappy guy proud. The first actual dinosaur I'll be talking about in this video is Muttaburrasaurus. This guy was a large, herbivorous iguanodont, and one of Australia's most famous dinosaurs. I really like my design for this animal. It might actually be one of my favourite designs of Volume 2, with the reverse counter shading, the blue highlights, and the flapper flabby neck flaps that flap away when it roars. You'll almost always see this animal depicted with a big trumpeting nose. Muttaburrasaurus does have a really big nose, and there's definitely something going on in that region of the skull, but these big inflatable honking structures you always see associated with the species are completely speculative. I do personally find it very hard to imagine this animal without them though, which is why I did it too. In the film, the juvenile Muttaburrasaurus doesn't quite have these structures yet, and he isn't very good at honking. But by the end of the film, after some time has passed, the blue coloration has started to appear. Coonburrasaurus was a small ankylosaur, or para-ankylosaur? I'm honestly quite confused as to what's going on with these animals. Regardless, I'm pretty confident that Coonborosaurus was a basal ankylosaurian dinosaur and Australia's most complete and best preserved dinosaur. This little guy is known from most of a skeleton, in articulation including a decent amount of the skin and the osteoderms. It's a really beautiful fossil. However, this charming little fellow was a little bit frustrating to research. This is because, when this beautiful nearly complete fossil was first described in 1996, it was actually thought to be another species of the far more famous Australian ankylosaur, Minmi. This was until 2015, when the specimen was reclassified as its own distinct genus and named Coonborosaurus. But because this animal was Minmi for so long, all depictions of Minmi you've probably ever seen have actually been Coonborosaurus. Definitive Minmi material is actually super sparse, so when Minmi is reconstructed even to this day, it is drawing far more from Coonborosaurus than itself. Which is a bit of a shame, because I think this little guy deserves more credit. With all of the major characters out of the way, it's now time to talk about the weird and wacky critters of Monsters Down Under. The first of these critters I'll be talking about is the small dinosaur called Nanantius. And I'll be honest with you guys, this is probably not a very good reconstruction of this animal, but it's kind of hard to tell. Nanantius is super fragmentary. It's a Cretaceous bird, essentially, but it's only really known from a shin bone and some neck vertebrae. And because it's so badly known, my Nanantius is admittedly just a re-edited and retextured version of Birdicus madeupicus from The Last Tyrant. The next critter featured in the film is Pachyrhizidus, a ray-finned fish. This is supposed to be the species Marathonensis, specifically, but I couldn't find any confident figures or photos of those fossils, so instead based it more on Pachyrhizidus caeneus and Groy, which have far easier to find figures. However, I did find a pretty cool paper about a fossil specimen of this fish from the Tullabuck Formation found infested with over 130 scavenging isopods, which caught my attention so much that I directly referenced it in the film. These little guys are Bruniga, I think, which I have almost certainly reconstructed too large in the film. I think these guys would have been actually, super tiny. The fourth critter I wanted to briefly mention is perhaps a surprising one. This seashell. These things can be seen throughout the film. The young Muttaburrasaurus picks one of these shells up. The shells are scattered all across the beach during the very first shot of the film and make one final appearance during the very last shot of the film. These are a species of Inoceremus, a Mesozoic bivalve, which are so abundant in the Tullabuck Formation and kept being mentioned when I was researching it that I felt I needed to reference them in the film somehow. Eventually, I decided to literally bookend Monsters Down Under with these animals. The second to last critter I want to mention are these ammonites. They're not really based on any particular species because I couldn't really find any definitive Tullabuck Formation ammonite fossils to base them on, but I have no doubt that they were there. Ammonites have been found in Australia, ammonites were everywhere. The final and the coolest critter featured in the film is Enketeuthus, a Cretaceous wiggly woggly. I decided to include this species to add to the upsetting and alien vibes of Monsters Down Under, but before working on this film I knew almost nothing about wiggly wogglies. And to bring one of these creatures to life, as well as the ammonite, in detail to 3D model, rig and animate these creatures, I had to learn at least the basics of how cephalopods like these work. How they're built, how they move, which parts are squishy, which parts shouldn't be squishy, which was honestly a whole lot of fun. I will take any excuse to learn about new, weird and wacky animals. And without this research, I wouldn't have any idea what a cephalopod's siphon is, which these guys use in the film to jet propel themselves away when they see the Kronosaurus above. Before I move on to the next segment, I wanted to announce that I'll be speaking again at DinoCon this year. I'll be doing a big presentation, and I'll also be showing off a brand new Dinosauria film. I am having so much fun working on Dinosauria Volume 2 that I decided to extend the series from 5 films to 6. Here's a clip of what I've been working on. DinoCon 2026 will be held in England at the Hilton Birmingham Metropole Hotel on July 25th and 26th. More information and where to buy tickets at the website on screen. I'm really excited. I loved meeting a bunch of you guys last year, and don't worry if you can't make it to the event and still want to see this new film. The film will be uploaded publicly here on YouTube just like the rest of the Dinosauria series sometime down the road. My animation style is a mix of 2D and 3D animated elements. In the simplest terms, all of the characters are 3-dimensional and all of the environments are 2-dimensional. In this making of video, I thought it'd be interesting to really go step by step through my creative process, cover exactly how I create these characters and worlds. I do all of my 3D animation in Blender, and every single character, be it a dinosaur, a pterosaur, a pliosaur, or a wiggly woggly, starts life as a default Blender cube. With this cube, I then subdivide, extrude, and stitch together the basic form of the animal. I base this shape on figures of the fossils, with gaps filled in by related species, but honestly, I kinda do most of this by eye. If the shape looks right, it looks right. I don't think I've ever directly followed somebody else's reconstruction. Ever. For example, there's a very large and very cool and very famous skeletal mount of Kronosaurus in Harvard, but that thing is also infamous for being mostly made of plaster, and has far too many vertebrae, and its anatomy and proportions are just way off. So I reconstructed my animal shorter, with a comparatively larger head, longer flippers. Honestly, my Kronosaurus looks a whole lot more like this PNSO model. But again, not exactly. For one thing, I'm really just not convinced of this horizontal tail fluke, so I gave mine a vertical one. This process of researching, educated guessing, going with whatever looks most natural is how I create all of the creatures you see in my films. My animation models are actually very simple 3D models, and that's because for my 2D, 3D animation style to work, the simpler these models are, the better. I sort of need to treat these 3D meshes like simple blank canvases for the more detailed texture work. I paint these textures onto my models like I would paint a sculpture, in layers, paying special attention to focal points like the head, the hands, and the feet. Areas that will likely be seen in close-up at some point during the film. This is when all of the little anatomical details are created, the folds, the shadows, the feathers, and the scales. It almost never ends there, though. I think every single dinosaur I've ever made has gone through texture tweaks over the course of a film's production. These changes can just be aesthetic things, like the face of my Kunbarasaurus, which I slightly redesigned halfway through this project. But more often than not, these changes are for storytelling or accuracy reasons. My Kronosaurus, for example, must have gone through 15 different texture variants over the course of this film. Initially, these changes were me trying to distinguish my design more from the Walking with Dinosaurs Leopleurodon. But eventually I also noticed that I put the nostril too far down the snout and had to fix that too. I also just created a ton of different variants for both the male and the female to help distinguish them from one another. I wanted them to be easy to tell apart, with two very distinct personalities, but without being overly stylized. It was a tricky balance, but these two designs you see here were the ones I finally settled upon. The next step is to rig the models so they can be animated. This doesn't just mean giving the model an armature, a skeleton, so it can move around. It also requires a lot of extra specific and minute controls to make the character look around, blink, breathe, wiggle, and even speak. At this point the character is basically finished. It's been 3D modelled, textured, rigged, and ready to be animated. The very first thing I do with every new character I make is animate a walk cycle, or a swim cycle, or a fly cycle, depending on the species. This gets me familiar with the animal, familiar with the rig, and helps me form the type of personality this character will eventually have. This stage is definitely the most gratifying, as it's the moment all of this hard work finally starts to come together. The moment that these fantastic and ancient animals that I love so much finally start to come to life. While all the characters in my films are three-dimensional, the environments are two-dimensional. So each of these backdrops is its own individual drawing. I often end up drawing hundreds of these backdrops per film, and to go over exactly how I do this, I'll be using this shot as an example. I actually do draw rudimentary storyboards for my films, which I don't think I've ever mentioned before. And that's because they look like this, and therefore are not worth mentioning. But using this storyboard as a template, the very first thing I do is animate all of the 3D elements in the scene, with a very simple mock-up of the environment. All of this is done in Blender. I then zoom out and crop all of the space that the camera covers during this shot, and render out a single frame of this open space, which I then take into Photoshop. Using this simple mock-up as a guide, I sketch out a more detailed version of the finished environment, usually colour-coded to help me separate which elements go to which layer, and then meticulously paint it all out. I do this in layers, and these layers can usually be separated into foreground and background elements. In this case, the background elements are the sea and these corals, and the foreground elements are these additional corals and the carcass. Specifically for this underwater shot, I also created a couple additional layers of cloudy ocean atmosphere as well. I then render out all of these separate 2D images and bring them back into my original 3-dimensional scene. And when all of these are lined up correctly, the shot finally starts to come together. If needed, I also add extra 2D animated details as well. For this film, these were mostly particle effects like bubbles and snow and splashing water. These can be created anyway in Photoshop or Blender, depending on the effect. I would call this an average backdrop, like a medium difficulty shot. Some backdrops are easier to draw, like this one, which understandably took just minutes. But some backdrops are super complicated, like this one, which took hours and hours and hours to draw. I've said this time and time again, but painting all of these backdrops is easily the most time-consuming part of my filmmaking process. It takes a very, very long time to create these worlds, especially for a film this long. And Monsters Down Under in particular goes to a huge variety of different locations. From the sea to the land to the sky, it's day and night, it's in the snow and in the sun. I am very, very happy with how this film looks though. The mostly desaturated colour palette perfectly communicates the cold, alien atmosphere of the film. And even though these were some of the least detailed backdrops I've ever had to draw, I actually especially like this big open sea and the vivid red column of blood that the Kronosaurus dance around. Monsters Down Under has an original soundtrack created by Ivan Duch. I told him I wanted the film to be atmospheric and alien, mysterious and dreadful, and the way Ivan took that and ran with it and weaved these unnerving themes into the very storytelling of this film, I think was just incredible. One of my favourite parts about this score is the recurring Kronosaurus theme that plays throughout the film, and how that motif evolves as the story develops. It starts off scary and dreadful as we know very little about these unknowable alien sea monsters. But by the end of the film, this theme has faded into something almost romantic, as we get to understand these animals as animals. The film even ends on the Kronosaurus theme, but this time played beautifully and triumphantly. As these sea monsters are now recontextualized as the complex, powerful, real-life marvels of nature that they truly were. Please do go check out Ivan's work if you haven't already. Links to his website, his Patreon, his whatever else are in the description. And make sure to give him a big thank you from me for his phenomenal work on this series. I cannot emphasize enough how much his music has elevated these films. I think the thing that bothers me the most about Monsters Down Under is also one of my favourite things about it, which is all of this snow. Australia was a lot colder in the early Cretaceous than it is today, but I read a lot of conflicting information about just how cold it got. Southern Australia has possible evidence of glaciation, it was within the Antarctic Circle, and would have seen months and months of total darkness during the Antarctic winter, but this film is set in the Tullabuck Formation, which is in northern Australia. It was still cold, but I think was just outside of the Antarctic Circle. Yearly temperature estimates I could find for this time and place were cool to temperate with a lot of rain, a place that seasonally would at least reach, if not freezing temperatures, like near freezing temperatures. Not gonna lie, very rainy, very seasonally cold, reminded me a lot of Scotland, where I live, and Scotland does get this cold, which is what inspired me to depict the Tullabuck Formation like this in the first place. However, I haven't once seen a piece of paleoart depicting Kronosaurus next to some ice, which is a pretty striking image, so while my research tells me that cold like this would be reasonable, just very rare, I can't help but shake this feeling that I've made a mistake. Regardless of scientific accuracy though, I honestly wouldn't really change any of this. All of this snow and ice looks fantastic, and it serves the story. It adds to the otherworldly atmosphere of the film, and it immediately tells the viewer how different Australia was during the Cretaceous, while also being based on enough science for me to be okay with it. There's also less snow and ice in this film than it might seem. It is snowing during this scene with the Muttaburrasaurus, but there's actually no snow or ice anywhere else in this film. The cliffs that the Halaskia are resting on might look like they're covered in ice, but this white stuff was genuinely intended to be pterosaur poo. Like, if you've ever been to a seabird colony, you'll know that the cliffs are absolutely caked in this stuff. This frozen area here is also technically not seawater, at least not entirely. It's a lake that's connected to the sea through a small channel. You can actually see the gap that opens up into the wider Eromanga Inland Sea in the distance. Later, the Kronosaurus even swims through this gap, and once the salt water mixes with the fresh water, the ice disappears, because fresh water freezes at higher temperatures than seawater does. Another thing that doesn't really bother me, but I think might bother some others, is the somewhat cartoony behaviour of the baby Muttaburrasaurus, being like too playful or cheeky, and I did second guess this a little. But this cutesiness was done deliberately. I wanted all of the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, everything above water, to feel like animals that we can understand with behaviour that's easy to read. This was to contrast the totally unknowable near-alien monsters beneath the sea. I wouldn't really consider this behaviour particularly anthropomorphised either. In fact, this very bespeckled beast served as my main inspiration for all of this mischievous behaviour. I've had to live with this bespeckled beast for over a year now, and I'm not totally sure what animal it is. I think it's a small and ugly horse. Monsters Down Under is one of the biggest and most time-consuming things I've ever made. It was an absolute behemoth of a project. I would estimate that the same amount of work, time and effort that went into this one 16-minute film is about on par with the first 3 episodes of Dinosauria combined. More than half of Dinosauria Volume 1's workload went into just Monsters Down Under. This amount of work would be otherwise near impossible, grueling, miserable for me, for just one guy to do it all on my own, if it weren't counterbalanced by the sheer joy and inspiration I get from making all of this cool dinosaur stuff. This film is as enormous as it is because I loved making it. I anticipate this making of video to be like the longest one I've ever made, like 45 minutes to an hour or something. It's gonna be huge, and I could talk about Monsters Down Under for another 5 more hours. Like, this isn't just my favourite film of the Dinosauria series, it's easily my favourite film I've ever made. It's one of my proudest creations ever. It's just exactly my type of film. It's slow, it's atmospheric, it's visual storytelling, brutality and beauty, horror and nature combined. Like, I didn't even get to talk about how this film is mostly desaturated with the vivid red blood running through the whole thing, signifying both beauty and terror, death of some things and the birth of others. I put so much into this. And I really do hope you guys liked it too. In my next Dinosauria film, however, we leave the cold sea behind and enter the dry Mongolian desert of the late Cretaceous. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to read through the sketchbook I've been showing off in this video, you absolutely can. Just go check out my Patreon page. By supporting my work there, you will also gain access to exclusive weekly posts, renders, artwork, and updates on my Dinosauria series. Posts just like the ones I'm showing on screen right now. This is by far the best way to keep up to date with the Dinosauria series and directly support it. Super special thanks to all my top Patreon supporters scrolling by on screen right now. I absolutely love making dinosaur stuff, and without all these wonderful people, gigantic projects like my Dinosauria series just would not be possible. So again, thank you.